She could not leave someone in need without help, but she did not know that this act would change her fate. The manager fired her in front of everyone, but the next day something happened that no one expected. Subscribe and tell me where you watching this video from. Lisa's days always started before the sun. While the world outside still lay wrapped in the quiet darkness of early morning, she was already on her feet, moving through the small, dimly lit apartment with practiced efficiency. The floor was cold beneath her bare feet as she stepped into the kitchen, filling the kettle with water. The apartment was silent, except for the gentle hum of the refrigerator and the occasional cough from the small bedroom where her mother slept. Lisa glanced at the clock. It was just after 5. She had an hour before she had to leave for work, an hour to make sure everything was in order before the long day ahead. She moved quietly, not wanting to wake her mother or her younger brother. James, 17 and on the cusp of adulthood, needed his rest. He had been up late the night before, hunched over his textbooks, his brow furrowed in concentration. College applications were looming, and he had been working tirelessly to keep his grades up. Lisa was proud of him, but the thought of how they would afford tuition weighed heavily on her mind. As the kettle whistled, she poured hot water over a tea bag, stirring it absently. Money was always tight. Between the rent, the utilities, the groceries, and most of all the medical bills, there was barely anything left at the end of the month. Her mother's illness had been a slow, relentless force draining their resources for years. The medication she needed was expensive, the doctor's visits even more so. Insurance barely covered anything, and every paycheck Lisa brought home seemed to disappear the moment it hit her bank account. Still, she managed. She had to. Lisa set a bowl of oatmeal on the table for James and left a note beside it, reminding him not to skip breakfast. Then she tiptoed to her mother's room, peeking in to check on her. The room was dark, curtains drawn against the pale light creeping through the window. Her mother lay curled beneath the blankets, her breathing shallow but even. Relief flickered through Lisa. At least today didn't seem to be one of the bad days. Some mornings, her mother could barely get out of bed, her joints swollen with pain, her body betraying her. Lisa exhaled and stepped back, closing the door softly. In the tiny bathroom, she splashed cold water on her face, trying to will away the exhaustion that clung to her. She studied her reflection in the mirror, dark circles beneath her eyes. A tiredness etched into her features that no amount of sleep could erase. She pulled her curly hair into a neat bun and reached for her uniform, a simple black shirt and slacks, both slightly worn from too many washes. The apron she would tie around her waist was already folded neatly in her bag. By 6, she was out the door, stepping onto the quiet street. The city was still waking up, the sky a dull gray as dawn crept in. The walk to the diner was familiar, every crack in the pavement memorized, every flickering streetlight a marker in her routine. The world around her was changing. Skyscrapers rising in the distance, expensive coffee shops and boutiques cropping up where old neighborhood stores used to be. But some things remained the same. The faces of the early morning commuters, the bus drivers, the sanitation workers, the other people like her who kept the city running while most of it still slept. The riverfront diner came into view, its neon sign buzzing faintly in the morning hush. A small, modest place, nestled between newer buildings that seemed determined to overshadow it. But the diner had its regulars, people who had been coming for years, drawn to the familiar comfort of greasy breakfasts and endless refills of coffee. Lisa stepped inside, the scent of frying bacon and freshly brewed coffee greeting her. The clatter of dishes, the low murmur of the radio playing from the kitchen. She took a breath, rolling her shoulders, preparing herself for another long day. She wasn't just a waitress. She was the heartbeat of this place, the one who remembered how Mr. Avery liked his eggs, over easy, never scrambled. The one who knew Mrs. Patterson preferred her coffee with just a splash of cream, no sugar. She was the one who greeted the early morning regulars with a warm smile, even on days when she felt like collapsing. Lisa tied her apron around her waist, smoothing the fabric, just as the door swung open and the first customers of the morning walked in. The day had begun. The morning rush at Riverfront Diner was always the same. The regulars trickled in first, men and women who had been coming for years, their orders second nature to Lisa. The clinking of cups, the low hum of conversation, the sizzle of eggs and bacon on the griddle. All of it was familiar, routine. Lisa moved through the diner with practiced ease, her hands steady as she poured coffee, took orders, and balanced plates on her arms. She had done this so many times that she no longer needed to think. Her body moved on instinct, a rhythm ingrained in her muscles after years of repetition. But the peace of the morning never lasted long. Tomas entered the diner at exactly 8:30, as he did every day. His arrival always brought a shift in the atmosphere, a subtle but undeniable tension that spread through the staff. Conversations among the cooks grew quieter. The busboys moved faster. Even the other waitresses, some of whom had been working here longer than Lisa, seemed to brace themselves. It was as if the very air in the diner grew heavier the moment he stepped through the door. He wasn't the owner, but he acted like he was. His official title was floor manager, but in practice he wielded far more power than that. He had been working at Riverfront Diner for over a decade, long enough to establish himself as an immovable presence. He ran the place with a sharp tongue and an iron grip, and everyone knew better than to cross him. Lisa barely looked up as he walked past her, though she could feel his eyes on her. She had learned not to react, not to give him the satisfaction of knowing how much he got under her skin. "Table 3 has been waiting too long," he said, his voice sharp. Lisa glanced at the table. She had taken their order less than 5 minutes ago. The kitchen was already working on it. There was nothing she could do to make the food cook faster, but she knew better than to argue. "I'll check on it," she said simply, keeping her tone neutral. Tomas lingered for a moment as if waiting for her to say something else. When she didn't, he huffed and moved on, turning his attention to another unfortunate employee. It was always like this. He never raised his voice outright, not in a way that could be called yelling, but his words carried a different kind of weight. He had a way of making people feel small, of turning minor mistakes into catastrophes. He never hesitated to call out employees in front of customers, making sure that everyone knew who was in charge. For Lisa, he seemed to have a particular fondness for criticism. She worked the longest shifts. She got the worst sections, the hardest tables, the least generous customers. If a mistake was made anywhere in the diner, Tomas found a way to pin it on her. If tips were lower than expected, he accused her of not being friendly enough. If the kitchen was slow, he blamed her for not managing the flow of orders better. It didn't matter what she did. Nothing was ever good enough for him. The worst part was that he knew she couldn't afford to leave. Once, early on, she had thought about quitting. She had been working at the diner for less than 6 months when she first realized what kind of man Tomas was. She had gone home one night, exhausted and near tears, and told herself she would start looking for something else. But where? With no college degree, No formal training in anything else. What other options did she have? The diner was steady. The tips, when good, made a difference in paying the bills. The idea of starting over, of taking a risk with no safety net, had felt impossible. So she had stayed. And Tomas had learned that she had nowhere else to go. She wasn't the only one he treated this way, but she was one of his favorite targets. Maybe it was because she never fought back. Maybe it was because she always smiled at customers, no matter how exhausted she was. Maybe it was because he could sense that she needed this job more than anyone else. The hours dragged on. By the time the lunch rush hit, Lisa had already been on her feet for 6 hours, and there were still 4 more to go. She felt the ache creeping into her calves, the tightness in her lower back, but she pushed through it, as she always did. At one point, she caught a glimpse of Tomas watching her from across the diner. He wasn't even pretending to be subtle about it. His arms were crossed, his expression unreadable. She turned away, focusing on refilling a customer's coffee. She refused to let him get to her, but the day wasn't over yet. Near the end of her shift, when the lunch crowd had begun to thin, Tomas approached her again. "The register's short," he said. Lisa looked up from wiping down a table. "What?" "We're missing $5. She frowned. "I don't touch the register. Only you and Marta do." Marta, the other waitress on shift, looked up from across the room. Her face was pale. "I counted it twice, Tomas. It wasn't short when I checked earlier." Tomas didn't even glance at her. His eyes were locked on Lisa. "Maybe you should be more careful with the tips you take," he said smoothly. "We wouldn't want anyone to get the wrong idea." Lisa's stomach twisted. She knew exactly what he was implying. She set down the rag in her hand, standing up straighter. "I don't steal." Tomas smiled, slow and deliberate. "Then maybe you should work on keeping better track of your numbers." She could feel the heat rising in her chest, but she forced herself to breathe. This wasn't the first time he had done this, accusing her of small, unprovable mistakes, planting the idea that she was the problem without outright saying it. She glanced at Marta, who looked down quickly, unwilling to get involved. Lisa turned back to Tomas. "I count my tips at the end of every shift. If there's a mistake, it's not mine." Tomas let the silence stretch, as if waiting for her to back down. Then he shrugged. "Just be careful," he said, his tone light, as if they were having a friendly conversation. "I'd hate to have to write you up." And just like that, he walked away, leaving her standing there, fists clenched at her sides. She wanted to scream. She wanted to throw something. She wanted to tell him exactly what she thought of him. But she didn't, because she couldn't afford to lose this job. So she took a deep breath, forced a smile back onto her face, and got back to work. As she cleared the last table of her shift, exhaustion settled deep into her bones. She thought about her mother. She thought about James. She thought about how much she hated this place and how much she needed it anyway. And then she walked into the kitchen, tied her apron a little tighter, and prepared for another long day. Lisa had learned to move through her shifts without letting exhaustion slow her down. The physical demands of the job were relentless, but she had adapted to them long ago. What drained her more than the hours on her feet or the endless repetition of tasks was the constant pressure of walking on eggshells around Tomas. Every shift was a test of endurance, not just physically, but mentally. She had to keep her head down, avoid mistakes, and never give him an excuse to make her life harder than it already was. The sun had begun its slow descent outside, casting long shadows through the diner's front windows. The lunch rush had ended, and the diner had settled into the lull of mid-afternoon. The usual crowd at this hour consisted of lone customers lingering over coffee, students tapping away on laptops, and the occasional trucker grabbing a late meal before heading back on the road. Lisa took a moment to catch her breath as she wiped down the counter, grateful for the brief respite before the dinner shift would start to pick up. Then the door opened and a man walked in. He didn't look like much at first glance. His coat was worn at the elbows, his shoes scuffed, and his posture carried the subtle hesitation of someone who was used to being overlooked. He moved slowly, as if every step required effort, and when he reached the counter, he didn't sit right away. Instead, he stood there for a moment, his gaze shifting around the diner, avoiding eye contact with anyone. Lisa had seen people like him before. The ones who lingered outside just a little too long before coming in. The ones who sat with their hands stuffed into their pockets, glancing at the menu without really reading it. The ones who counted their money before ordering, lips moving silently as they added up what little they had. She set down the cloth she had been using and walked over to him with a smile. "Afternoon," she said. "Can I get you something?" The man finally looked at her. His eyes were tired, but there was a quiet kindness in them, a gentleness that made Lisa pause. He hesitated before answering. "Just coffee." She nodded. "Coming right up." She turned to grab a cup, but as she did, she saw him reach into his pocket, fingers fumbling as he pulled out a handful of coins. He spread them out on the counter, counting them carefully. Even before he finished, Lisa could tell it wasn't enough. She hesitated for only a second before pouring the coffee anyway. As she placed the steaming cup in front of him, she leaned in slightly and spoke just above a whisper. "It's on me." The man's head snapped up, his eyes wide with surprise. For a moment, he didn't speak. He just looked at her, as if trying to decide whether or not to believe what he had just heard. Then, slowly, his expression softened, and the faintest hint of a smile touched his lips. "Thank you," he murmured, wrapping his hands around the cup like it was the first warm thing he had touched in days. Lisa just nodded and stepped away to give him space. She didn't think much of it. It was just a cup of coffee. Just a simple act of kindness, the kind she had seen other people do without hesitation. She had watched the older waitresses slip an extra muffin onto a plate for a struggling single mother. She had seen the cooks make a little extra and quietly pass it to a regular who had fallen on hard times. It was nothing special. But then she glanced toward the back of the diner and saw Tomas watching. Her stomach dropped. He was leaning against the kitchen doorway, arms crossed, expression unreadable. But Lisa knew that look. She had seen it too many times before. The moment stretched too long before he finally pushed away from the wall and started walking toward her. Lisa forced herself to keep moving, busying herself with refilling another customer's water glass, pretending she didn't notice him. But she could feel him coming closer, the weight of his presence pressing against her like a storm cloud ready to break. She barely had time to brace herself before his voice cut through the air, low and sharp. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" She turned to face him, keeping her expression neutral, refusing to let him see how her pulse had quickened. "It was just a cup of coffee," she said evenly. Tomas's eyes flicked to the man at the counter, who was sipping his coffee slowly, unaware of the storm brewing behind him. "If he can't pay, he can't stay," Tomas muttered, voice laced with irritation. Lisa swallowed the anger rising in her throat. She knew there was no use arguing. Nothing she said would change his mind. But she also knew she couldn't take the coffee back. She had already made the choice. Tomas took a step closer. His voice dropped lower just for her. "You're stealing from the diner." Lisa's fingers curled into her apron. "It's just a cup of coffee," she repeated, her voice calm but firm. He looked like he needed it. Tomas let the silence stretch, long enough to make it uncomfortable, long enough to make sure she knew exactly who was in charge. Then he spoke, and his words landed like a blow. "You're fired." For a second, Lisa thought she had misheard him. The diner fell silent. Even the faint sounds from the kitchen seemed to still. A few customers turned their heads, their forks frozen halfway to their mouths. One of the cooks peeked out from behind the pass, his face tight with unease. Lisa's heart pounded, but she stood her ground. She had always known this moment would come. She had known, deep down, that no matter how careful she was, no matter how much she endured, Tomas would find a reason to get rid of her eventually. She just hadn't expected it to be over something like this. Tears burned at the back of her eyes, but she blinked them away. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction. Slowly, she reached behind her and untied her apron. She folded it neatly, placing it on the counter with steady hands. Then she met Thomas's gaze and, in a quiet voice, said the only thing that mattered. "I hope one day you realize that kindness is worth more than a few extra dollars." Then she turned and walked out. The last thing she heard before the door swung shut behind her was the faint clatter of a spoon against porcelain, the quiet sip of a man drinking the coffee she had given him. And then she was gone. She found her mother in the small bedroom at the back of the apartment, propped up against a stack of pillows, a blanket wrapped around her thin frame. Her eyes flicked up at Lisa's entrance, and for a moment, Lisa thought she might have managed to keep the truth from her. Then her mother's gaze softened, and Lisa knew she hadn't fooled her at all. "Baby," her mother said quietly, "what happened?" Lisa opened her mouth, then closed it again, her throat tightening. She had wanted to tell the story in a way that made sense, a way that didn't make her mother worry. But standing there, with the day still clinging to her like a weight she couldn't shake, she couldn't find the words. Her mother didn't push. She just reached for Lisa's hand, her fingers warm but fragile against Lisa's own. Lisa sat down on the edge of the bed, staring at their joined hands as she finally spoke. "I got fired," she said. The words felt strange in her mouth, like they didn't belong to her. Her mother exhaled, slow and steady. "What happened?" Lisa swallowed, her fingers tightening around her mother's. "I gave a man a cup of coffee." Her mother didn't react right away. She just waited, knowing there was more. "He couldn't pay for it," Lisa continued, her voice quieter now. "Tomas saw. He said I was stealing. He fired me on the spot." Silence stretched between them. Then her mother sighed, reaching up to gently brush a hand over Lisa's cheek, the same way she had when Lisa was a child. "You did the right thing." Lisa blinked, the tightness in her chest growing stronger. "But what about the rent? What about—" Her mother shook her head. "We'll figure it out. We always do." The certainty in her voice should have been comforting. Instead, it made Lisa's throat ache with unshed tears. She wanted to believe her. She really did. But as the night stretched on, as she lay awake staring at the ceiling, she couldn't see a way forward that didn't end in disaster. By morning, she was up early, scouring job listings on her phone, sending out applications to anywhere that looked even remotely promising. She walked to every nearby diner, every cafe, every store that had a "Help Wanted" sign in the window. Most of them weren't hiring. The few that were looked at her with apologetic smiles, telling her they'd keep her resume on file. By the third day, the panic had fully set in. James noticed, of course. He always noticed. "You'll find something," he told her over dinner, stabbing his fork into the sad excuse for pasta they had thrown together with the last of their groceries. Lisa forced a smile. "Yeah." Her mother said nothing, but Lisa caught the way she looked at her, worry hidden behind a carefully neutral expression. The worst part wasn't the fear of not finding work. It was the way Tomas had taken so much from her beyond just the paycheck. He had taken her security, her stability. He had taken the one thing she had been able to count on. And the world kept moving like nothing had changed. 3 days turned into 4, 4 into 5. Lisa was running out of time. Then, on the 6th day, everything changed. She was sitting at the kitchen table, phone in hand, scrolling through yet another list of job postings that led nowhere, when there was a knock at the door. James looked up from his homework. Lisa frowned. They weren't expecting anyone. She rose, padding to the door, hesitating before unlocking it. When she pulled it open, the last person she had expected to see was standing there, the man from the diner. But he didn't look the same. The worn coat was gone, replaced by a perfectly tailored suit. His posture was different, straighter, more assured. His shoes were polished and his hair was neatly combed. For a long moment, Lisa just stared at him, then slowly he smiled. "Lisa," he said, "I'd like to talk to you." She should have been suspicious, should have asked why he had come, how he had found her, but something in his voice, in the quiet kindness she had seen in his eyes that day in the diner, made her step aside and let him in. As he walked past her, Lisa had the distinct feeling that whatever he was about to say would change everything. She just didn't know how much yet. Lisa stood frozen at the door, staring at the man who had, only days ago, sat in the diner cradling a cup of coffee like it was the only warmth he had known in years. That man had been quiet, hesitant, wearing the kind of exhaustion that seeped into his bones. The man standing before her now was entirely different. His posture was straight, his shoulders squared, and his clothing was sharp, the kind that spoke of wealth and power. The transformation was so stark that, for a moment, she wondered if she had imagined their first meeting all together. Behind her, James had gotten up from the table, peering curiously from the kitchen. Lisa barely registered the movement. Her pulse was still racing, her mind struggling to connect the dots. She started, then stopped, unsure of what she was even asking. The man smiled slightly, as if he understood her confusion. "I'm sorry for showing up like this," he said, "but I needed to find you. May I come in?" Lisa hesitated. Letting strangers into their home was not something she made a habit of. But was he really a stranger? He had been there the day her entire life had collapsed. He had seen what had happened, and somehow something told her that he wasn't here to make things worse. She stepped back. "Come in." The man nodded in gratitude and stepped inside, taking in the small apartment with a glance, but not in a way that felt judgmental. James had already retreated back to the table, his eyes still flicking between Lisa and the stranger, clearly intrigued but wary. Lisa closed the door behind them and turned to face him, arms crossing over her chest. "All right," she said, trying to keep her voice steady despite the uncertainty coiling in her stomach. "Who are you?" The man exhaled as if he had been waiting for that question. He glanced down for a brief moment, then met her gaze directly. "My name is William Hutton," he said. I own the Riverfront Diner, and about 50 others just like it." Lisa blinked. The words didn't register at first. She felt James still behind her. The room seemed to shrink around them, the air thick with a silence that stretched far too long. She replayed the words in her head. He owned the diner, not just Riverfront, but 50 others. "You're joking," she said before she could stop herself. Hutton, because now she could hardly think of him as just the man, smiled faintly. "No, I'm not." Lisa shook her head, still trying to process. You were." She gestured vaguely, unable to find the right words. "I was in your diner, yes," Hutton said. "Not as myself. I do this from time to time. I go undercover to see how my businesses are run, to see how my employees are treated. It tells me more than any report ever could." Lisa stared at him. The pieces were clicking into place, but they still didn't make sense. Hutton had been watching. He had seen how she treated him, seen how Tomas treated her. And now he was here. Lisa's stomach twisted. "If you're here to offer me my job back, don't bother," she said, her voice sharper than she intended. Hutton's expression remained unreadable, but there was something almost amused in his gaze. "That's not why I'm here." Lisa frowned. "Then why?" Hutton took a step forward, his tone turning serious. "Because I made a mistake." Lisa's frown deepened. "When I go undercover," he continued, "I observe. I don't interfere. It's how I see the truth of how my businesses operate." His jaw tightened slightly. "But when I saw what happened to you, I should have stepped in right then. I shouldn't have let you walk out that door thinking the world was punishing you for doing the right thing." Lisa swallowed hard. She had spent the last few days convincing herself that what happened wasn't unfair, that it was just life, that she had made a choice and had to live with it. But now, standing here, hearing those words, something inside her cracked just a little. "I don't understand," she said finally, her voice quieter now. "I came to fix what should never have happened in the first place," Hutton said. Lisa wasn't sure what she had been expecting him to say. Maybe an apology, maybe an offer to let her return to her old job. But the next words that came out of his mouth nearly knocked the breath from her lungs. "I'd like to offer you a position as a manager at one of my flagship restaurants." Lisa blinked. She must have misheard. "Excuse me?" Hutton's expression was calm, steady. "You handled yourself with more grace and integrity in that diner than most people in positions of authority ever do. I watched you that entire shift. You worked hard. You knew your customers. You treated people with respect, even people who couldn't pay. That's the kind of leadership I want in my businesses." Lisa's thoughts scrambled for a response. This doesn't make sense," she said, shaking her head. "I don't have any experience as a manager." "You ran that diner better than the man who was supposed to be in charge," Hutton countered. Lisa opened her mouth, but no words came out. James let out a low whistle from behind her. Lisa turned to look at him, and he raised his hands in surrender. "Hey, I'm just saying, this sounds like a good deal." Lisa turned back to Hutton. I don't even know what to say." "Say yes," Hutton said simply. "Say yes, and I'll make sure you get the training you need. Say yes, and you won't have to worry about making ends meet anymore." Lisa's breath hitched. He said it so easily, as if it were that simple. As if all the years of struggle, of scraping by, of carrying the weight of her family on her back could be undone with just one word. But it wasn't just about her. "My mother," she said finally. "She needs medical care. My brother—" "I know," Hutton said gently, "and I can help with that, too." Lisa stared at him. She should have been suspicious. This was too good to be real. But there was something in Hutton's eyes that made her believe him. Real kindness. Not the kind that asked for something in return. She thought of the moment in the diner, the way his hands had curled around that cup of coffee, how he had looked at her like he hadn't expected anyone to show him warmth, and now he was standing here offering her everything she had spent years thinking she would never have. Lisa inhaled deeply, then she nodded. Yes, Hutton's smile was warm, genuine, good, and just like that, everything changed. The next morning, Lisa woke up feeling like the world had shifted beneath her feet. The weight she'd been carrying for so long, the crushing uncertainty, the constant anxiety over money, the endless struggle, was still there, but lighter now, as if some invisible hand had lifted a part of the burden. For the first time in what felt like forever, there was something ahead of her other than mere survival. She moved through the morning with a strange sense of detachment, almost as if she were outside of herself, watching this new version of her life unfold. Her mother, though still weak, seemed to sense the change in Lisa's demeanor. She didn't ask many questions, just held her hand for a long moment and said, "You deserve this." James, on the other hand, couldn't stop talking about it. "You know what this means, right?" he said over breakfast, his voice brimming with excitement. "You're not just getting a better job, you're about to be in charge. A manager, that's huge." Lisa nodded, though she still wasn't sure she could fully grasp it herself. "Yeah, it is." "And Mom's bills." James trailed off, his expression turning more serious. "Hutton's really going to help?" Lisa thought of the way Hutton had looked at her when he had made that promise. He hadn't said it like a businessman making a deal. He had said it like someone who understood. "I believe him," she said simply. James leaned back in his chair, shaking his head with a low whistle. "Damn. A week ago, you were working double shifts just to keep us afloat, and now you've got a shot at a real future." He grinned at her. "Guess kindness does pay off." Lisa smiled, but her mind was already moving ahead to what was coming next. She didn't just have a new job to step into. There was unfinished business that needed to be handled. Hutton had been clear about that when he left the night before. "Come with me tomorrow," he had said. "There's something you should see." Now, as Lisa buttoned up the new blouse she had bought years ago for interviews, one of the few professional pieces of clothing she owned, she felt an unfamiliar energy coursing through her. It wasn't just relief. It wasn't just hope. It was something deeper. She had spent years swallowing her pride, keeping her head down, accepting the way things were because she hadn't had another choice. But now she did. And for the first time, she was going to walk back into that diner not as the woman who had been pushed out, but as the one who was finally standing tall. Hutton's driver picked her up just after 10. She slid into the sleek black car, feeling out of place in the smooth leather seats, but Hutton greeted her with the same easy warmth as before. "Ready?" he asked. Lisa nodded. "Yeah." The drive to the diner felt shorter than usual, or maybe that was just the anticipation buzzing under her skin. When they pulled up to the familiar building, Lisa's stomach twisted, but she forced herself to keep her head high as she stepped out of the car. Inside, the morning rush was winding down. The scent of coffee and grease filled the air, the sounds of clinking dishes and murmured conversations washing over her. She had spent so many hours in this place, and yet it already felt different now. Hutton walked beside her, his presence commanding attention without effort. People turned to look. The waitstaff froze mid-step, eyes widening. The kitchen door swung open, and Marta, one of the other waitresses, nearly dropped the tray she was carrying when she saw them. And then Tomas appeared. The moment his eyes landed on Lisa, his expression darkened. He glanced at Hutton, his mouth already curling into the practiced smirk he used when trying to impress people he considered important. "Mr. Hutton," he said smoothly. "What a surprise." Hutton didn't return the smile. Tomas hesitated, his gaze flicking to Lisa, then back again. "If I had known you were coming, I would have made sure everything was in top shape." Lisa could see the calculation in his eyes. He was trying to figure out why she was here, why she was standing next to the owner of the company, and she could see the moment the first hint of unease settled in. "Let's talk in your office," Hutton said. Tomas hesitated again, but then nodded. Of course. Lisa followed them, her pulse steady despite the storm of emotions churning inside her. The office was as small and cluttered as she remembered. Piles of papers stacked on the desk, a calendar with smudged notes scribbled along the margins. Hutton didn't sit. Neither did Lisa. Tomas, however, settled into his chair, lacing his fingers together like he was already preparing to handle whatever was coming his way. "So," he said, leaning back, trying to appear relaxed, "what can I do for you, Mr. Hutton?" Hutton was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You can explain why you fired one of the best employees this place has ever had." The smirk faltered. Lisa didn't move, didn't blink. She let the silence stretch. Tomas's fingers twitched slightly. He exhaled sharply through his nose. "Ah," he said. "I see. This is about Lisa." Hutton raised an eyebrow. Tomas spread his hands like this was all one big misunderstanding. "Mr. Hutton, I was simply enforcing company policy. She gave away food without payment. You mean she gave a man a cup of coffee?" Hutton interrupted. Tomas hesitated. "Well, yes, but it sets a precedent. If we let employees hand out food whenever they want—" "That man was me," Hutton said. Tomas froze. The blood drained from his face so quickly that Lisa thought for a moment he might actually faint. Hutton let the weight of that revelation settle before he continued. "And you, Tomas, made a very poor decision that day." For the first time since they had walked in, real fear flickered across Thomas's expression. His mouth opened, then shut again. His mind was racing, trying to salvage the situation, but there was no way out of this. Lisa should have felt vindicated. And she did. But she also felt something else, a sense of closure. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about justice. It was about standing up for herself in a way she had never been allowed to before. Tomas swallowed hard. "Mr. Hutton, You're fired." The words landed like a hammer. Lisa watched as Tomas's entire body tensed as the full weight of his downfall crashed into him. He tried to compose himself, but there was no talking his way out of this. No excuses left to give. Hutton didn't wait for a response. He turned to Lisa. "Would you like to say anything before we go?" Lisa looked at Tomas. For years, she had let him tear her down, let him make her feel small, but now, as she stood here, she realized he was the one shrinking, so she just smiled. "I hope one day you realize that kindness is worth more than a few extra dollars," she said, and then she turned and walked out. This time, she wasn't leaving in defeat. She was walking toward something better. Lisa stepped out of the diner, feeling the crisp air against her skin, but this time it didn't feel like the sting of defeat. This time it felt like a breath of something new, something she had never quite allowed herself to believe in. Possibility. For the first time in years, she wasn't leaving with the weight of exhaustion pressing her shoulders down. She wasn't walking home with the sting of humiliation clinging to her skin like a second layer. No, This time, she was walking away from the past, away from the nights of swallowing her pride, keeping her head down, and telling herself that surviving was enough. Hutton walked beside her, his stride slow, measured. He hadn't said much after they had left Tomas's office, but he hadn't needed to. Everything that needed to be said had already been laid bare in that room, in the way Tomas's voice had cracked, in the way his smirk had faded, in the way Lisa had looked at him for the last time, no longer afraid. "Are you all right?" Hutton asked finally as they reached the car waiting at the curb. Lisa nodded, though it wasn't a simple question, and the answer wasn't simple either. She was all right, but she was also something more, something she wasn't sure she had words for yet. She was relieved, but also still stunned. She was lighter, but also heavier, with the realization of how much had changed in the span of just a few days. She looked at Hutton, studying him. He was an enigma to her still. A man who had once sat at a counter with worn elbows on his coat and quiet gratitude in his voice, now standing before her with the kind of power that could change lives with a single decision. And he had changed hers. "I'm all right," she said. Then she hesitated. I keep waiting for it to feel real." Hutton's lips curved slightly, a knowing look in his eyes. "It will," he said, "sooner than you think." She exhaled, nodding, then slid into the car beside him. The city blurred past them as they drove, but Lisa barely noticed. Her thoughts were already turning toward what was next. A new job, a new position, a new role that she wasn't sure she was ready for, but one she would step into anyway. When they pulled up outside her apartment, she hesitated before opening the door. "Why me?" she asked suddenly, turning to Hutton. He met her gaze without hesitation. "Because I watched you," he said simply. "I saw how you treated people, not just customers, but your coworkers too. I saw how you handled yourself under pressure, how you kept going even when things were hard. And most of all, I saw someone who understands what it means to lead, even when they don't have a title." Lisa let his words settle over her. She had never thought of herself as a leader before. She had never thought of herself as anything other than someone who worked hard because she had no other choice. But maybe, just maybe, there had been something more in her all along. She stepped out of the car, offering him one last nod before heading inside. James was waiting, his eyes bright with expectation. "Well?" he asked the moment she stepped through the door. Lisa let out a breath, then smiled. "I start Monday." James whooped, throwing his hands in the air. "That's what I'm talking about." Lisa laughed, shaking her head. "It still doesn't feel real." "It will." He echoed Hutton's words without knowing it. Then his smile softened. "I'm proud of you, Lisa." Lisa swallowed past the lump in her throat. "Thanks, little man." That night, she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about everything that had led her here. The years of struggle, the nights of counting crumpled bills and wondering how they would stretch them, the mornings spent forcing a smile onto her face even when she felt like breaking. And then she thought about what was ahead. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't just thinking about surviving. She was thinking about what it might mean to truly live. Monday morning arrived with a quiet kind of weight, pressing against Lisa's chest as she stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the collar of her new blouse. The fabric felt strange against her skin, too crisp, too unfamiliar. For years, she had worn the same simple uniform, tying her apron around her waist like armor. This was different. This was a statement, a symbol of change. James leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, watching her with a smirk. "You look like a boss," he said. Lisa huffed out a laugh, shaking her head. "I feel like I'm pretending." James shrugged. "Fake it till you make it, right?" She turned to face him fully, exhaling through her nose. "This is really happening, isn't it?" James nodded. "It is." She grabbed her bag, gave him one last look, then headed out the door. The city felt different that morning, though she knew it was the same. The same streets, the same distant hum of traffic, the same early commuters rushing to work with coffee cups in hand. But Lisa walked with a different energy, an awareness of herself she hadn't had before. She wasn't just another waitress trying to make it through another shift. She was stepping into something new, something bigger. The restaurant where she would be working wasn't just another small diner. It was one of Hutton's flagship locations, a sleek, modern establishment that catered to a different kind of clientele. As she approached the building, she felt her nerves stir, but she pushed them down, reminding herself that she had earned this. Hutton was waiting for her just inside the entrance, dressed impeccably as always, but there was warmth in his expression as he greeted her. "Ready for your first day?" he asked. Lisa nodded, straightening her shoulders. "Ready as I'll ever be." He smiled approvingly. "Good. Let's get you introduced." The staff was already gathered, waiting. Lisa felt their eyes on her as she stepped forward, Hutton at her side. Some were curious, others unreadable. She understood their skepticism. She was new. She had no experience as a manager, but she wasn't here to prove she deserved the job. She was here to do it. Hutton addressed the team, his voice steady and confident. He spoke about changes, about leadership, about the kind of work environment he wanted to foster. Then he turned to Lisa. "This is Lisa," he said. "She's your new manager. Treat her with the same respect you expect from her." Lisa met their gazes, one by one, letting the silence settle before she spoke. "I know I have a lot to learn," she admitted. "But I also know what it's like to be in your shoes. I know what it's like to work long hours, to deal with difficult customers, to feel like you're not being heard. My job isn't just to run this place. It's to make sure we all succeed together." There were a few nods, a few thoughtful glances exchanged. Then one of the servers, a young woman with dark curls pulled into a tight bun, stepped forward. "Welcome to the team," she said, offering a small smile. Lisa smiled back. The day moved forward in a blur. There were schedules to go over, systems to learn, 100 little details she needed to absorb all at once. But through it all, Lisa felt something she hadn't felt in years: purpose. She wasn't just working to get through the day. She was building something. As the evening rush began, she found herself stepping into old habits, helping with orders when the staff was overwhelmed, running plates to tables when they were short-handed. It wasn't about proving herself. It was just who she was. By the time the last customer left and the doors were locked, Lisa felt the exhaustion settle into her bones, but it was a different kind of exhaustion than before. It wasn't the hopeless kind. It was the kind that came from knowing she had done something that mattered. Hutton lingered as the staff began cleaning up, watching her with something like approval in his gaze. "How do you feel?" he asked. Lisa wiped her hands on a towel, exhaling. "Like I belong here." Hutton nodded. "You do." She met his gaze, something unspoken passing between them. Gratitude, respect, understanding. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out an envelope, holding it out to her. Lisa frowned, taking it cautiously. When she opened it, her breath caught. A check. Enough to cover her mother's medical bills. Enough to ensure James could start school without worry. Enough to give them a chance at something better. Her eyes burned. her fingers tightening around the paper. She swallowed hard, shaking her head. I don't know what to say. Hutton smiled. Say thank you. She let out a shaky breath, then met his gaze. Thank you. He inclined his head. You earned it. As she stepped out into the night, the city lights stretching out before her, Lisa felt something settle deep in her chest. She had spent so long believing that kindness was something you gave without expecting anything in return. But tonight, she knew the truth. Kindness always comes back. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Check out more videos on the channel for more inspiring stories. And if this one touched you, share it with someone who might need to hear it.